On August 8, 1945, inside Moscow, Japanese Ambassador Naotake Sato was still carrying a dying hope. Tokyo wanted the Soviet Union to help negotiate an end to the war, not surrender without conditions, not humiliation, something softer, something that could save the emperor system, protect the army's honor, and keep Japan from being occupied like a conquered enemy. For weeks, Sato had been trying to reach Soviet Foreign Minister Vyacheslav Molotov. He had waited. He had sent messages. He had watched silence turn into danger. Then Molotov finally received him. But the meeting was not the rescue Tokyo had imagined. Molotov handed Sato the Soviet declaration of war. From August 9, the Soviet Union would consider itself at war with Japan. In one meeting, Japan's last diplomatic escape began to vanish. The country had already seen Hiroshima destroyed 2 days earlier. American forces were closing from the Pacific. General Douglas MacArthur was preparing for the occupation that would make him the face of Japan's defeat. But the fear now moving through Tokyo came from somewhere older, colder, and more humiliating. It came from the memory of a Soviet commander who had shown Japan exactly what could happen if its army tried to fight north. His name was Georgy Konstantinovich Zhukov. The strange part is that Zhukov was not standing in Moscow with Sato that night. He was not commanding the Soviet invasion of Manchuria in 1945. By then, he was already famous for crushing Nazi Germany and taking Berlin. But 6 years earlier, on a forgotten border of Mongolia and Japanese-controlled Manchuria, Zhukov had taught the Japanese army a lesson it never fully forgot. That lesson did not arrive with speeches. It arrived with tanks, aircraft, artillery, and a ring closing around men who had believed the Soviet Union could be tested. And that is why the question is not as simple as asking whether Japan feared MacArthur. MacArthur represented the American victory everyone saw. Zhukov represented the Soviet danger Japan had already felt in its bones. Subscribe to Drafted History for more forgotten history and declassified stories. Watch till the end because the truth is not that simple, and comment on your country below. You have to go to the Khalkhin Gol River. In May 1939, on the border between Mongolia and Manchuria, small clashes began between Mongolian forces backed by the Soviet Union and Manchuria forces backed by Japan. To outsiders, the place looked remote, almost empty. To the Japanese Kwantung Army, it was a frontier where ambition could be tested. Manchuria was Japan's puppet state in Manchuria, created after Japan seized the region in 1931. It was supposed to be a shield, a resource base, and a stepping stone into the Asian continent. The border itself was disputed. Mongolia and the Soviet Union treated the Khalkhin Gol River area one way. Manchuria and Japan treated it another. At first, the fighting could be described as another incident, the word Japanese officers often used for conflicts they did not want to call wars. But that word hid the danger. Incidents could grow. Patrols could become detachments. Detachments could become divisions. And on that open ground, far from the world's attention, the Japanese army was about to meet a commander who did not fight the way they expected. Japan entered that clash carrying old confidence. In the Russo-Japanese War of 1904 and 1905, Japan had shocked the world by defeating the Russian Empire. That victory still lived inside Japanese military culture. It proved, at least to many officers, that Asian discipline and will could overcome a larger northern enemy. And inside the Kwantung Army, some believed the Soviet Far East could be challenged again. This was the northern dream: strike north, push toward Siberia, take pressure off Japan's empire by reaching for resources and strategic depth on the continent. It was never the only vision inside Japan. The Navy and others looked south, toward Southeast Asia and the oil-rich Dutch East Indies. But in 1939, the northern idea still had powerful believers. The men near Namonhan did not think they were making one of the great decisions of the coming war. They thought they were defending a border. That is how disasters often begin. Not with a giant announcement, not with a leader saying he is about to change history, just a patrol, a report, a map line, and officers who believe the other side will back down. Japan's 23rd Division, commanded by Lieutenant General Michitaro Kamatsubara, became the main Japanese formation drawn into the fighting. It was part of the Kwantung Army's world, proud, aggressive, and used to operating with a dangerous amount of freedom from Tokyo. The Soviet side at first did not look unbeatable. There had been confusion. There had been losses. The battlefield was distant from Soviet bases. Supplies had to move across punishing space. If Japanese officers believed they could force the Soviets into a limited defeat, they were not imagining a fantasy. They were making a bet. Then Zhukov arrived. He was not yet the towering marshal of World War II legend. He was a hard, rising Red Army commander, sent to take control of a crisis that Moscow could not afford to lose. He had seen war before. He had survived the brutality of the Russian Civil War and the politics of Stalin's army. And when he reached the front in Mongolia in June 1939, he did not treat the fighting as a border argument. He treated it as a military problem that had to be solved completely. That difference mattered. The Japanese expected courage to decide the issue. Zhukov prepared weight. He built supply lines. He moved armor, aircraft, artillery, and trucks into place. The Soviets had to bring men and fuel across long distances, and that alone was a warning. A commander who could feed a mechanized force in that emptiness could turn an isolated frontier into a killing box. The National WWII Museum describes the fighting as 4 months in which Soviet forces, led by a capable young Zhukov, used tanks and aircraft to encircle and destroy much of the Japanese force in the area. That is the part Japan could not easily explain away. If the Soviets had only won by numbers, the lesson would have been smaller. If the Japanese had only suffered a temporary setback, the shame might have faded. But Khalkhin Gol showed something more dangerous. Japan's infantry-centered confidence could be trapped by modern combined arms. Tanks did not need to be symbols. Aircraft did not need to be terror weapons alone. Artillery did not need to speak separately. Under a commander like Zhukov, they could move together at the right moment, in a way that swallowed an enemy force before it fully understood what was happening. In July, Japanese forces tried to push hard. Their attacks were brave, but bravery does not fix a bad position forever. Japanese troops fought across rough ground near river crossings. Under pressure from Soviet firepower, the Kwantung Army had expected the Soviets to bend. Instead, Zhukov studied them, reinforced his front, and waited. That waiting was part of the dread. On the Japanese side, men could see Soviet strength increasing, but they did not know exactly when the blow would land. They were far from home. They were tied to a border command that had turned a local fight into a major confrontation. They had officers above them who could still talk about honor, spirit, and aggression. But on the ground, men heard engines. They saw aircraft. They felt the pressure of a battlefield that no longer matched the story they had been told. Then came August 20, 1939. Zhukov launched his offensive. It was not a simple frontal shove. Soviet and Mongolian forces struck from multiple directions, using armor and air power to surround the Japanese around Namonhin. The Japanese 23rd Division and attached units were pushed into a situation where movement narrowed, escape became harder, and courage turned into endurance. The battlefield that had once seemed open began to close around them. For the men caught there, the fear would not have been clean. It would have been confusion first. Reports not matching what they expected, units losing contact, commanders trying to understand where the Soviet main effort was. Then the realization that the enemy was not just attacking, the enemy was surrounding. That one detail changes the emotional weight of Khalkhin Gol. A defeated army can retreat, an army under pressure can regroup, but an encircled force starts to feel the future shrinking. Every road matters. Every message matters. Every hour makes the question darker. Are we still fighting to win, or only fighting because no one has told us how to get out? The Japanese fought hard. Nobody should mistake defeat for lack of courage. But courage was not enough. Their doctrine and equipment were being tested against a Soviet method that was harsher, faster, and better suited for the open steppe. Japanese casualty numbers remain disputed, but Japanese military records and later studies point to roughly 20,000 battle and non-battle losses, with some wartime claims going higher. The exact numbers still matter to historians. To the men inside the trap, the only number that mattered was whether their own unit would still exist by morning. By the end of August, the Japanese force had been crushed. The fighting ended with an armistice signed on September 16, 1939. On paper, the border returned to the status quo. On maps, the world barely noticed compared with what was happening in Europe, where Germany had invaded Poland at the beginning of September. But inside the Japanese army, the damage was deeper than a map line. Zhukov had not just beaten a Japanese formation. He had exposed a strategic fantasy. The Kwantung Army had believed it could test the Soviet Union and control the size of the fight. Zhukov proved that the other side could choose the scale too. He showed that a northern war would not be a heroic march into Siberia. It could become a vast mechanized trap, fought across distances where Japan's weaknesses would grow every mile from the railhead. This is where the title begins to answer itself. MacArthur frightened Japan later because he came with America's industrial power, island campaigns, bombers, submarines, and invasion plans. But Zhukov frightened Japan in a different way. He represented the enemy Japan had already tried to measure and failed to break. He was not a prediction. He was evidence. And evidence is harder to argue with than fear. After Khalkhin Gol, Japanese leaders had to face an uncomfortable truth. The Soviet Union was dangerous on land. Not in theory, not because diplomats said so, because Japanese units had been surrounded and wrecked in front of their own commanders. The Northern Road now looked less like expansion and more like disaster. That did not mean Japan suddenly became peaceful. It meant the empire looked for another direction. On April 13, 1941, Japan and the Soviet Union signed the Soviet-Japanese Neutrality Pact in Moscow. The document named Molotov for the Soviet side and Foreign Minister Yasuke Matsuoka and Ambassador Yoshitsugu Taitkawa for Japan. In its second article, the pact said that if either country became the object of hostilities by third powers, the other would observe neutrality. That pact was not friendship in the warm sense. It was a cold arrangement between powers that did not trust each other enough to fight yet. For Japan, it helped secure the northern flank. For the Soviet Union, it reduced the danger of a two-front war while Hitler's Germany became the greater threat. For both, it was a pause built on fear and calculation. And that pause helped shape the Pacific War. Japan turned south. The empire needed oil, rubber, and raw materials. The United States, Britain, and the Netherlands stood in the way. The Southern strategy led Japan toward Southeast Asia, the Philippines, and ultimately Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941. That path brought MacArthur into the center of the war. It brought the fall of the Philippines, the long American drive back across the Pacific, and the famous promise of return. But the Southern road did not erase the Northern wound. It only buried it. Every year after 1939, the memory of Khalkhin Gol remained in the background. Japanese planners could talk about the United States. They could talk about China. They could talk about island defenses and naval battles. But the Soviet border was still there. Manchuria was still there. The Kwantung Army was still supposed to protect Japan's continental empire. And somewhere in that strategic memory was the knowledge that a Soviet commander had already shown what could happen if Japan misread Moscow. If you are still watching, subscribe and like the video. Then drop your thoughts in the comments. Was history told right, or are we missing something? By 1945, Japan was no longer choosing between expansion routes. It was choosing between terrible endings. American submarines had strangled shipping. B-29 bombers had burned cities. Okinawa had shown how costly an invasion of the home islands could become. The United States had enormous plans for Operation Downfall, the proposed invasion of Japan. MacArthur was expected to play a central role in the invasion of Kyushu under Operation Olympic, planned for November 1945, if surrender did not come first. This is the MacArthur Japan could see. He was the visible American sword. He had returned to the Philippines. He had become a public symbol of Allied pressure. Japanese leaders knew an American invasion would be catastrophic. They also knew the United States demanded surrender under the Potsdam Proclamation, issued on July 26, 1945, by the United States, Britain, and China. But Tokyo still looked to Moscow. This is one of the most painful details in the end of the war. Even after years of brutal conflict, Japan's leadership still hoped the Soviet Union might mediate. It was a desperate hope, but not random. The Soviet-Japanese Neutrality Pact was still in the background, even after Moscow announced in April 1945 that it would not renew the pact when it expired. Tokyo wanted to use Stalin as a bridge to better terms. Think about the danger of that mistake. Japan was asking help from the same power whose army had humiliated it at Khalkhin Gol. It was trusting silence from a government already preparing to enter the war. It was trying to negotiate through a door that was being locked from the other side. Then, on August 6, 1945, Hiroshima was destroyed by the first atomic bomb used in war. The shock inside Japan was real. Leaders had to confront a weapon unlike anything seen before, but the Japanese government did not surrender that day. The Supreme War Council remained divided. Some leaders wanted peace if the imperial institution could be preserved. Others still hoped to fight for better terms. Military hardliners believed the homeland defense could make invasion so costly that the Allies might compromise. That is why the next blow mattered so much. On August 8, Molotov received Sato in Moscow and delivered the Soviet declaration. The Avalon Project's text of the declaration records that Molotov told Sato Japan was the only great power still standing for continuation of the war after Germany's defeat, and that the Soviet government would join the war against Japan. From Tokyo's point of view, this was not just another country joining the Allies. It destroyed the mediation plan. It opened Manchuria. It threatened Korea. It endangered northern territories. It meant the Kwantung Army might collapse. It meant Japan could no longer imagine a divided enemy camp where Moscow might soften Washington's terms. The old ghost from Khalkhin Gol had returned. Again, Zhukov himself was not the commander crossing into Manchuria in 1945. The Soviet Manchurian strategic offensive was overseen by Marshal Alexander Vasilyevsky, with major fronts under commanders including Rodion Malinovsky, Kirill Meretskov, and Maxim Perkiev. But the operational nightmare Japan faced in 1945 was the same kind of nightmare Zhukov had revealed in 1939. Speed, encirclement, armor, air power, and the sudden collapse of assumptions. On August 9, Soviet forces attacked. The Imperial War Museums describes 1.5 million Red Army troops sweeping across the border into Manchuria. On the same day, Nagasaki was destroyed by the second atomic bomb. Manchuria was not just any occupied region. It was called the jewel in the crown of Japan's colonial empire, a huge base of resources, industry, settlement, and military prestige. The Kwantung Army had once been one of Japan's proudest commands. By 1945, it was weakened. Many of its best units had been stripped away to fight elsewhere. Equipment, training, and readiness had declined. Yet on paper, it still symbolized Japan's continental strength. It was supposed to be the shield. The Soviet offensive made that shield look hollow. Soviet forces came through terrain the Japanese had considered difficult, even protective. They attacked across mountains, deserts, and fortified zones. They moved fast enough to make Japanese command reactions feel late almost as soon as they were made. Units that expected time found speed. Officers who expected a border defense found a theater-wide assault. And for civilians in Manchuria, the fear was not strategic. It was immediate. Japanese settlers, railway workers, officials, families, and colonial subjects were trapped inside a collapsing empire. Some had believed Manchuria was a permanent home. Some had no power over the decisions that put them there. Chinese and Korean communities had already lived for years under Japanese rule, carrying their own wounds, losses, and anger. When empires fall, the people at the bottom often pay first, even when they never sat in the rooms where the maps were drawn. That is the human cost, hidden behind military arrows. In Tokyo, the reports were devastating. The United States had shown it could destroy cities from the air. The Soviet Union had shown it could tear open Japan's continental empire from the ground. One threat came from above. The other came across the land. Together, they left almost no room for the old military argument that Japan could still shape the ending. But the debate did not end cleanly. Historians still argue over what finally forced Japan's surrender. Some emphasize the atomic bombings, especially Hiroshima, as the decisive shock. Others emphasize Soviet entry into the war because it destroyed Japan's last diplomatic option and threatened the empire from a new direction. The Imperial War Museum notes that the debate remains alive. Whether the atomic bombings or the Soviet invasion finally persuaded Japan's hardline army leaders to surrender rather than fight to the end. That debate is exactly why this history still pulls people in. If you say the atomic bombs alone ended the war, you risk missing the Soviet pressure that landed at the worst possible moment for Tokyo. If you say the Soviet invasion alone ended it, you risk ignoring the psychological and political impact of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And if you say Japan was already finished, you still have to explain why its leaders had not surrendered before August 1945. The truth sits in the pressure between all three. Japan was losing. Japan knew it was losing, but knowing defeat is coming is not the same as accepting surrender. Governments can keep fighting long after victory is impossible. Armies can demand one more battle. Leaders can convince themselves that suffering will buy better terms. And civilians who never made the decision can be forced to wait under the shadow of that pride. That was the moral break in Tokyo. The question was no longer whether Japan could win. It could not. The question was how many people would be pulled into the final fire before the leaders admitted it. If the United States invaded, the losses could be immense. If the bombings continued, more cities could disappear. If the Soviets advanced further, Japan risked not only defeat but division, occupation from multiple directions, and perhaps the destruction of the very imperial system leaders were trying to preserve. Inside that pressure, Emperor Hirohito intervened. The National WWII Museum notes that Japanese military leaders debated surrender until the last moment, and that Hirohito's intervention was critical. Even then, surrender was not guaranteed. Some military officers resisted the decision. The idea of accepting defeat was unbearable to men raised inside a system where surrender was dishonor. The famous imperial recording had to be protected before it could be broadcast. The final days were full of fear, confusion, and factional danger. Japan was not a machine calmly choosing peace. It was a collapsing state trying to stop its own momentum before the army, the enemy, or both carried it over the edge. On August 15, 1945, the Emperor's broadcast announced acceptance of surrender to the Japanese people. Many ordinary listeners had never heard his voice before. The language was formal and difficult, but the meaning slowly became clear. The war was ending. The empire had failed. The suffering, though not over, had reached a turning point. MacArthur would soon stand in the center of the public ending. On September 2, 1945, aboard the USS Missouri in Tokyo Bay, Japan signed the Instrument of Surrender. MacArthur presided over the ceremony as Supreme Commander for the Allied powers. The image was powerful: American ships, Allied officers, Japanese representatives, and a defeated empire made to sign under the eyes of the world. That is why MacArthur became the face. He was there when the surrender became visible. He ruled the occupation. His name entered the memory of post-war Japan in a way few foreign commanders ever have. For Americans, the story often ends there, with MacArthur, the Missouri, and victory in the Pacific. But Japan's fear did not begin on that deck. Years before, on a forgotten frontier, Zhukov had shown Japan a different kind of defeat. Not naval blockade, not island hopping, not strategic bombing. A land army trapped, surrounded, and broken by a Soviet commander who understood speed and mass better than the men facing him. That memory mattered because Japan's empire was not only an island empire, it was also a continental empire. Manchuria, Korea, and occupied China were central to its power. The United States could threaten the home islands from the sea and sky. The Soviet Union could threaten the empire's land spine. When both pressures arrived together in August 1945, Japan's leaders had to face something worse than defeat. They had to face closure. No diplomatic escape through Moscow, no safe northern flank, no Kwantung army strong enough to hold Manchuria, no guarantee that the emperor system would survive if the war continued. No clean way to play one enemy against another. Every road out was closing at once. That is why the title is not really about a popularity contest between generals. MacArthur was the man Japan surrendered in front of. Zhukov was the man who had already helped convince Japan that the Soviet land threat was not a theory. MacArthur represented occupation. Zhukov represented the old warning: if Japan fought north, it could be encircled and destroyed. And in August 1945, that warning came back with an army behind it. The historian Tsuyoshi Hasegawa has argued that Soviet entry into the war had a more powerful effect on Japan's surrender decision than the Nagasaki bombing, while also stressing that no single factor should be treated as a simple knockout punch. Other historians disagree and place more weight on the atomic bombings, especially Hiroshima. That disagreement is not a weakness in the history. It is the wound at the center of it. Because the real ending was not clean. It was not one general. It was not one bomb. It was not one meeting. It was a chain of fear. Khalkhin Gol in 1939, the Neutrality Pact in 1941, Hiroshima on August 6, Molotov's declaration on August 8, Manchuria and Nagasaki on August 9, the imperial decision, the broadcast, and finally the surrender ceremony in Tokyo Bay. But if the question is why Japan feared Zhukov more than MacArthur, the honest answer is this: Zhukov scared Japan before MacArthur had the chance to become the symbol of defeat. He proved that the Soviet Union could break Japanese confidence on land. He damaged the Northern strategy. He left behind a military memory that made the Soviet invasion of Manchuria in 1945 feel like the return of a nightmare Japan had already survived once. MacArthur came at the end with ceremony, authority, and occupation power. Zhukov came earlier with a warning. And sometimes the warning frightens a nation more than the final signature. The modern world should not treat that as dead history. Countries still build plans around old victories, old humiliations, and old fears. Armies still tell themselves that the next crisis will stay limited. Governments still believe they can open a small door to violence and close it whenever they choose. Khalkhin Gol showed how dangerous that belief can be. A border incident became a strategic lesson. A forgotten battlefield helped shape the path toward Pearl Harbor. A Soviet victory in Mongolia echoed all the way to Japan's final decision in 1945. Thanks for watching till the end. Subscribe to Drafted History, like the video, and share your thoughts below. Then watch another story from the channel. So if you had been inside Tokyo in August 1945, with Hiroshima gone, Nagasaki burning, MacArthur waiting, and the Soviet army tearing through Manchuria, what would you have feared most? The enemy you could see coming, or the old nightmare that had already proved Japan could be broken?